Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player. We are looking at role-playing monsters. How do you role-play those that are different? Those that have different origins to the usual species. Giants, diminutives, all the like, as well as undead and everything in between. So how do you roleplay a monster? And how do you make sure that your monster's powers, abilities, actions don't destabilize the game to such a point that they become irritations rather than a good, entertaining narrative? Well, these are my 8 ideas. Pardon me. These are my 8 ideas on how to play a monster and get away with it. Now, the very first thing, before we even get into the ideas, is that you must check with your game master first whether she allows for monsters to be played in that campaign and whether they exist or not, and also to find out how they're treated. If you want to play a satyr or a minotaur and they are automatically beheaded on sight whenever they enter into a human city, then you are going to have problems. Now, this is not to say that your GM must now change the culture of the people. It is to say that you need to be aware of it and have a solution as to how you are going to allow yourself to still walk into that city and not get captured. Because you being captured creates a whole different adventure path to what the GM had planned as to what your fellow players might have had planned for their characters. And that's imposing your character preference onto the game of everybody else's. And that's something that you want to avoid, because otherwise it becomes very, very tedious. Oh, all right, look, Minos is once again in trouble for just being the race they're being. Really, we've got another bribe that becomes routine. You don't want that. So, firstly, look at your intent in terms of playing a monster. Is your intent to be a good monster, or is your intent to be a bad monster? If your intention is to be a bad monster, well, then this video is not really for you. I've got videos on how to play evil characters, and, well, a bad monster is just a stereotype, if you ask me. That's why they're a monster in the first place. If trolls were good-natured individuals, they wouldn't be called monsters, would they? They'd be called trolls. Well, anyway. So, assuming that you are going to play a good monster, you are trying to break against the stereotype of the monsters that exist in the rest of the world, and you just happen to be a minotaur with heart, you are an undead, you are a vampire with a soul, you want to be someone different. So you find out your intention first, and then stick to that intention. So if you're a vampire who does not want to kill any sentient creatures, then everything you do must be focused around that. Now, why do I say that? Well, your intention is what drives your character, and that's what's going to differentiate your character from all the other monsters. And I personally feel that if you're not creating this monster to explore the differences, to explore stereotypes, to explore unpacking those kind of things, then why are you creating the monster in the first place? If it's just to get the powers and abilities of that monster, then I think you're missing the point of role-playing. That's my personal opinion. However, your intention should indicate the goal of the monster. Why did the monster leave their labyrinth in the first place? Why is this vampire now seeking to do right by the world? Why is the zombie now different? And what is their goal? So I penned a screenplay with a friend of mine called Cadbury, The Last Christmas Zombie. And it was a Christmas movie that, well, never got made because we never finished the proposals and things, about a zombie who was created as Santa Claus arrived in the home and spread a little bit of merry cheer. So Cadbury the zombie, when he woke up as a zombie, had a craving for chocolate, not for brains. And so fled to a tomb or mausoleum in a local graveyard where he would spend his days nomming chocolate and trying to help all of those who rose from the dead to find peace and generally just be a nice zombie. When the zombie apocalypse breaks out, of course, Cadbury is placed in the center of this maelstrom of hatred against zombies and, of course, falls in love with Lily, a living human who eventually falls in love with him as well. The point of the matter, though, was that Cadbury was dedicated to not hurting anybody else and to making sure that everyone was happy. So throughout the film, there are many protagonists there are many antagonists, I should say, who hunt Cadbury down, who try and destroy him, including his own brother, who of course has been turned into a zombie, and those kind of things. And they all try and commit grievous amounts of violence. And of course, it's a zombie movie, so we expect to see people being ripped in half and blood and guts and all that kind of stuff. So Cadbury is rebelling against that, and that's what makes him an interesting character, and his decisions equally interesting and frustrating. He refuses to commit harm, and so by sparing the lives of those that would harm him, he ultimately ends up in a more precarious situation. That is the idea behind intent, is it drives narrative, but it also creates interesting characters who are not just cookie-cutter characters. And it gives you a point of contention. You don't want to do this because your character doesn't believe it to be right, etc., etc. Now, for a good character, the idea is to then examine stereotypes, to examine what the PC knows in terms of their race, in terms of the attitudes of others, and to determine the reactions of others. If you are playing a vampire, and you have been a vampire for the longest time, you will know that people are afraid of vampires, that people expect steak, silver, and running water and garlic to prevent vampires from continuing to exist, or crossing, etc., etc. As a Minotaur, you know people expect you to be bull-headed and to get your way out of mazes fairly easily. So it's about looking at what is the stereotype for the race, for the monster, what is the common knowledge for that monster, and what do people expect and how do they react to that kind of monster. And the reason you do that, of course, is so that you can quite specifically play up to some of those elements and be the exact opposite to others. The vampire who doesn't want to drink blood of living. All right, he doesn't want to drink the blood of the living. What is he going to drink? And how is he going to impress that upon his fellows? And what will he do when people say that he drinks the blood of the innocents? Terry Pratchett explored vampires. They had the Black Ribboners, vampires who had sworn to never drink the blood of the living of humans, and they would do something else. True Blood's vampires had a what is wrong with me today? True Blood had synthetic blood, so True Blood they called it, which came in different tastes, A negative, B negative, O positive, and all the combinations therein, and apparently tasted absolutely ghastly to the vampires, but it helped sustain them so they didn't have to take lives. So by understanding what everyone expects from your monster, you can then play against it and play towards it, and that makes for more interesting decisions from your monster. Size differences become an important factor. If your monster is huge, how do you handle fitting under door frames that you have to lower down and moving through tight spaces? Size is something that we very seldom take into account in role-playing, but if you're a good role player, you will do so. Equally, if you are short and you can barely make it up onto the surface, that becomes a problem too. Short characters may not be able to reach things. Something that you will need to learn how to use for effect. Maybe they have a little bar stool that they keep in their backpack, which they put down so they can gain height when they walk into a space. How do they survive in that world? The more that you can throw in, the more detailing that you can put in of your character, based on this information, the realer your character will feel. The more it will feel as if your character is from that space, and the more your fellow players will respond to your character. Powers and abilities. Now, I had a player whose character was turned into a vampire and slowly started to discover the ability to command wolves, turn it into mist or a flock of bats. I still think it should be called a squeak of bats or a sonic of bats. Anyway, turn into a swarm of bats and take to the night, and of course suffer penalties and punishment when out near the sun, and of course burn up in the sun. So the character was exploring those powers and abilities, and it is something for you to decide to do so as well. Something that could be interesting is the character who refuses to use their powers. The undead who consciously breathes to make sure that their chest rises and falls, who eats regular food only to throw it up later after everyone's gone away. All those kind of things. It makes for a more interesting character. So you look at your abilities and you work out, yes, these are powerful abilities and supposedly they're balanced with everybody else's. How do I make them interesting? How do I make them as they are part of the character? And what does the character feel about those abilities? Perhaps the satyr who can charm individuals hates the fact that it is a magical power that causes individuals to be charmed by the satyr. They would far rather have it that the person is interested in them as an individual without using magic to try and convince them that they should like them. Maybe that's something that you can explore, is the hatred of the powers. We then look at solutions to avoiding general populations. The horns are a giveaway. How do you work around the horns? Well, maybe you have a metal helmet that's been designed that fits around the horns, so it looks as if your character is simply wearing a horned helmet. Maybe you have shaved the horns off and have grown a huge mane of hair to hide them. Whatever your choices are, you need to have a game plan in terms of how to avoid upsetting the cart by going into a social space as a monster. And the idea of, oh, well, I'll just wait outside of the city. No, no, no. In that case, tell your GM, all right, listen, phone me when you guys have finished your city adventure, and then I'll come back to the table. But until then, I'm going off and I'll see you guys in a couple of weeks. Sitting outside of the city is frustrating for you and for your fellow players, and most especially for your GM. Why should she now have to split her story so that something works outside of the city as well as something inside of the city every single time you come to a city because you haven't come up with a solution as to how they should act in a city, how they're going to get around that? No. So you must come up with a solution as to how you move around those cities. Is it illusion spells? Is it charm spells? You could even ask the GM, please give me a magical item. I know it's fairly powerful, but it'll only be used to transform me from this form into that form. Maybe it's a vampire who's obsessed with makeup and has to spend at least 20% of all of the treasure that she earns by buying makeup, or he earns by buying makeup so that he has at least a certain skin color and lips have a certain redness to them without having to feast on 15 hobos before they start to look normal again. Something else to do whilst playing a monster is to explore the dark side of the monster. Everything has a dark side. Humans are replete with them. But monsters have the stereotypical dark side. The vampire who can't sustain his craving any longer must feed upon the innocent. The Minotaur has an unquenchable desire to just charge into battle. Those kind of racial trappings we can then explore. And you can explore how it makes your character feel. You can explore your character trying to avoid it, your character embracing it, your character journeying away from it. All of those kind of things get combined to create this very interesting, very difficult character to play that has these layers of complexity. Yes, I have this power, but I don't want to use it. Or maybe I have decided the rest of the world is useless. Although I've tried to fit in with humanity, humanity hasn't tried to fit in with me. So I will use my dark powers this once just to prove that I am the terrible monster that they say that I am. And then immediately regret it. Or not, depending on how you want to play it. Then finally, cherishing the culture of the species. The Minotaur, who, although is an isolationary species, perhaps longs to return to their own kind one day, or has these little ceremonies that they perform, and as a result, every night must bang on some drums for half an hour. Or there is a vampire who, although they have to return to the earth in their coffins or sacred sites, perhaps there is a vampire who wishes to be with other vampires, even if it is just to gain some insight and some knowledge into their own culture. So the idea of embracing the culture of your species is also important, and exploring it and avoiding it. If you look at Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, for example, the one monster, the character Odo, wanted to return to his people. And then once he had, he didn't want to go back. But secretly, he still harbored a desire to return. And that played out for a long, long, long time and gave very many interesting stories. So those are my thoughts, my insights, my ideas on how to play a monster in such a way that you are having so much fun with the story and so much fun exploring these differences that it feels as if you are quite literally this strange beast that is very different from the regular type of beasts that we play in our role-playing games. If it has, hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And join us on Twitter at GM Tips, I think it's called, or at How to GM. The link will be on the bottom. I'm terrible at this sort of thing. I'm just absolutely terrible at it. Anyway, the link is at the bottom of the screen now. You can join us on Twitter, where we have these kind of oddball discussions and things, and prompt questions and that kind of stuff. And I do try and respond to as many as I can, but again, time is not an ally at the moment. So until then, I wish you and yours the happiest of playing.